The actual beginning, though it's not really the beginning, but the actual flashpoint was, I remember very clearly. I can still see the corner in my house in 20 Northmore Road where it happened. I got an enormous pile of exam papers there, and I remember picking up a paper and actually I nearly gave an extra mark for it, extra 5 marks actually. There was one page on this particular paper was left blank. Glorious. Nothing to read, so I scribbled on it, I can't think why. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. I now wanted to try my hand at writing a really stupendously long narrative and to see whether I had sufficient art, cunning, or material to make a really long narrative which would hold the average reader right through.
Before the first season of Rings of Power came out, I made a video that basically said that, like with any piece of media, we should withhold judgment on the show until we actually see it. So, roughly 2 years later, and with the second season here, let's judge it.
The Southlander will face judgment.
But this isn't going to be a comprehensive look at the show or my many thoughts about it, because that would end up being a colossal video. If you want a really in-depth deep dive, I can recommend this excellent and nuanced video by 𝗘𝗩𝗘𝗥𝗎𝗪, another New Zealand YouTuber.
There are dozens of us. Dozens!
No, I knew that if I was going to make another video about Rings of Power, then I had to keep it focused, and on rewatching the series recently, I realized that a lot of the problems I had with this show all come back to the fact that it's trying to be Lord of the Rings. Now, that might sound obvious. I mean, it's literally adapted from the Lord of the Rings, but what I mean is, it's not trying to be this Lord of the Rings, but this Lord of the Rings. In the lead up to its release, the showrunners went to huge efforts to convince us all how faithful this adaptation would be to Tolkien. It was a core part of their marketing and was something that they and the cast emphasized again and again in interviews and promo for the show. But when it came out, it became clear that this show was not so much a story inspired by Tolkien's writing, characters, world, and ideas, so much as it was a show inspired by the Peter Jackson film adaptation. So many of the core emotional, character, and story moments in the Rings of Power are directly inspired by a similar moment from the Lord of the Rings movies. And I'm going to look at this in more detail in a moment, but first, let me explain why this is a problem. Because the Jackson trilogy is, by general consensus, the epitome of a faithful adaptation. Even when it changed things, most fans still holds up as the gold standard. So of course the makers of Rings of Power would want to emulate that success. But that's where the problem lies, because that trilogy was driven by being a good adaptation of Tolkien. The Rings of Power was driven, I think, by trying to copy the success and style of the Jackson trilogy. It's kind of like how the original Star Wars trilogy was inspired by samurai movies and historical epics and so on, whereas the sequel trilogy was inspired by Star Wars. And what that means in both cases is that instead of trying to tell their own stories in their own way, a lot of key moments rely on our nostalgia for or knowledge of the original series. For example, take the moment when the Southland turns into Mordor. This is presented as a huge moment in the show. The music builds dramatically and it's essentially the climax of the 7-episode Southland story arc. But this reveal is like the infamous Khan reveal in Into Darkness or Blofeld in Spectre. It only means something to the audience because of our existing knowledge of this world. It means nothing to the characters and would also mean nothing to a first-time viewer. If this was your first ever exposure to The Lord of the Rings, then you would be left wondering what the hell Mordor is and why it is important. And the exact same thing happens here.
Mithril.
Or later that same episode.
Palantir.
The Palantir is an object that we, the audience, associate with evil because of who uses them in The Lord of the Rings. But at this point in time, the Palantiri are not associated with evil because none of them are held by evil characters. But as we can tell from Galadriel's reaction, the framing, and the music, the show is trying to create dramatic tension from its reveal. But this dramatic tension comes from the audience's knowledge of this, not because of anything these characters would associate with it. But they still chose to shoot it like this. I wonder where they thought of that framing. But to be fair, entering it does look pretty cool. And to be clear, this is not a problem unique to the Rings of Power. It's a common problem with prequels of all sorts, but it's frustrating to see it in the Rings of Power because, unlike, say, The Hobbit, this series takes place thousands of years before the events of The Lord of the Rings, and more importantly, Rings of Power is, ostensibly, supposed to be completely independent from the Jackson trilogy. Now, the showrunners have of course acknowledged the Jackson films, but insist they are not motivated by them, saying, anyone approaching The Lord of the Rings on screen would be wrong not to think about how wonderfully right Jackson got so much of it. But we're admirers from afar. That's it. The Rings of Power doesn't try to compete with him. Let's start with the similarities in production design, which, to be fair, they have actually acknowledged is an inspiration.
The thing we always talked about was that it should feel different but familiar. It should feel like Middle-earth, but a new Middle-earth, a wilder Middle-earth.
I actually think that's fine. The Jackson trilogy was largely designed by two of the most prominent Tolkien artists of the 20th century, one of whom also worked on Rings of Power. So it's natural for the show to want to draw on those same sources of inspiration and to employ the likes of Weta Workshop to bring it to life. And on the whole, besides some of the sets looking a bit artificial, I actually think the production design of this show was one of the high points, especially the orcs. I mean, these guys look fantastic, and I think that incorporating their sensitivity to sunlight was a great touch and is a rare example of a case where this series used an idea from Tolkien that's not in the Jackson movies. So yeah, I have no problem with Numenor looking like Minas Tirith, but where those visual similarities do start to become a problem is when they do things like this. This happens several times in the Rings of Power and is 100% a Jackson trilogy trope. This does not happen in Tolkien's writings. This is Rings of Power explicitly copying Jackson's way of representing Sauron. And the reason they do that is because they know when you see this, you will immediately think of this. So at best, this is just a lazy stylistic choice because they couldn't figure out their own way to represent Sauron, and at worst, it's a deliberate decision to directly rip off the Jackson trilogy in order to try and get an emotional response in the audience by association. And speaking of things they chose to depict exactly the same way Jackson did, oh man, where do I even start? Maybe in episode 1.
That our days of war are over.
That we may share in the days of peace.
Or episode 2. Episode 3? And surely by episode 4 they're doing their own thing.
Loosen your arm, will loosen your lips.
I'm gonna bleed you like a stuck pig.
Not if I stick you first.
Seriously? Well, maybe in episode 5 they... Oh, come on, can't you just go one episode without ripping off Jackson? Okay, that one is quite obvious, but maybe in episode 7 they... Okay, to be fair, Jackson ripped that off Ralph Bakshi, but surely by the final episode of Rings of Power we have stopped copying him? See what I mean? And these weren't even the only examples I could have used. Almost every single episode has moments like this where the visuals are lifted directly from the Jackson trilogy. But it's not just the visuals. So much of the show is totally reliant on our familiarity not so much with Tolkien, but with the Jackson movies. Take one of the central mysteries of the show. Is the stranger Sauron? Now, if this was your first ever Lord of the Rings story, then you might genuinely be wondering this, although probably not, because they never show him being evil, they just show him doing slightly harmful things in a way that is clearly unintentional or accidental, and only explicitly raise the question of if he is Sauron in the final episode about 20 minutes before they reveal who Sauron actually is, so this is a pretty crap mystery whichever way you cut it. No, the real mystery of this character is effectively, is this Gandalf or Saruman? Which is also a crap mystery because, like these, the reveal means nothing to the characters, only the audience who have seen the movies and therefore know who those characters are. And to be fair, Tolkien fans would also be wondering the same thing about this character, and they might even get bonus points for asking if it is in fact one of the blue wizards. But then the show goes and does this.
When in doubt, Eleanor Brandyfoot, always follow your nose.
That is a line of Gandalf's dialogue from the Jackson movies.
If in doubt, always follow your nose.
Nothing resembling that line ever appears in the books at all. So this just confirms how this entire story arc was built around an audience's pre-existing knowledge of a character and an expectation that this knowledge came from the movies, not from the books. And to use another example, you have Halbrand, aka Sauron, aka Discount Aragorn, the humble outcast rugged man who is destined to become king but does not want that role. Others can see his potential and his destiny to fulfill his claim to the throne, but it is a responsibility that he adopts reluctantly. Yeah, Aragorn in the books is not a reluctant king. He literally carries the shards of Narsil around with him all the time, and he is never in any doubt that he'll one day reclaim the throne. The whole reluctant king thing is 100% something the movies did to make his character more relatable and to give him more of an arc. So yeah, Halbrand is discount Aragorn, but he is discount movie Aragorn. Everything about him is inspired by how that character is written in the Jackson adaptation, not how Tolkien wrote him. And further confirming this is the fact that a key plot point of the show relating to Sauron, the fact that his identity was hidden, is actually something that happens in the books. But in the books, Sauron adopts the guise of Anatar to fool Celebrimbor into making the Rings of Power. But instead of doing that, the writers instead chose to copy movie Aragorn by disguising Sauron as a reluctant human king in exile, which they did because we were concerned about a situation where the part of the audience steeped in lore is 6 or 7 episodes ahead of the characters. If deception is an important part of the journey, we wanted to preserve that experience for book readers too. Guess what? That's just how adaptations work. People who know the source material are always going to be one step ahead, and they're going to be annoyed at you for making such a big change like that just for the sake of giving them a mystery, which, as we have seen, is not really a mystery because of course Halbrand was fucking Sauron, because it's definitely not the stranger and the only other viable candidate is Adar, but we rule that out literally the moment we meet him.
I am no god.
So rather than just adapting Tolkien's writing when creating Sauron's character arc in this show, they instead based his character arc on the popular human character in the Lord of the Rings movies. After all, the movie had a cool human ranger type guy, so obviously we need someone similar. This is also why they thought that it wouldn't be a Middle-earth story if there were no hobbits, even though most Middle-earth stories do not feature hobbits. But I won't even get started on discount Samwise because this constant falling back on the Jackson trilogy happens so often that it even filters into minor scenes like this one.
This wound needs elvish medicine.
In Rings, the elvish healing is necessary because Frodo was stabbed with a Morgul blade. Here, Halbrand just has a regular, normal wound. But no, we need to manufacture a reason to get Halbrand to Eregion urgently, so why not just rip off a scene in the movies where we need to get an injured person to an elvish city urgently? And yeah, the scene appears in the book, but it has nowhere near the urgency or speed that it does in the movie. They don't meet Glorfindel until about 2 weeks after Weathertop, and the journey to the ford also takes a fair while before the Wraiths catch up to them. So this scene in Rings of Power is more similar to how it is depicted in the movies than it is in the books. But the big giveaway is this line.
This wound needs elvish medicine.
The phrase elvish medicine is not in the book, but you know where it does come from?
He needs elvish medicine.
And this isn't the only time they nick dialogue from the movies that doesn't appear in Tolkien.
We should never have come in here.
We should never have come here.
But even when they're not lifting dialogue directly like this, they instead just take the overall concept, flow, and style of a scene and change it up a bit to suit their story. Like this.
Feanor's hammer.
Shards of Narsil.
The tool that wrote the Silmarils.
Blade that cut the ring. Sauron's hand.
And the reason that this is a problem is because it's copying the scene from the movie, but it doesn't understand why that scene worked. The scene with Boromir and Narsil works so well because A, we the audience already know about Narsil from the prologue, and B, it's used to set up Boromir and Aragorn's different perspectives on the shared history of their people, which is the foundation of their character dynamic for the rest of the movie. In Rings of Power, this scene is just an Easter egg to try and get a reference to Feanor in there, but it is clearly drawing its inspiration from this scene in the Jackson trilogy, which, again, is not in the books. But for me, the worst example of this in the entire series is when they try and do the Ride of the Rohirrim. It's one of the best scenes in the whole trilogy, book or film. I mean, I made a whole damn video explaining just why it works so well. Rings of Power tries to directly copy that and just completely messes it up in every way possible. Frankly, it's kind of impressive that they got it so wrong, but just briefly, here's why this works and this really doesn't. For a start, we don't see them on their way. Before this shot, the last we saw of the Númenóreans was when they were still on the boat. We knew that they were going to the Southlands, but we have no idea where. They have no knowledge of this specific village or the threat that it's under right now, only vague notions that Sauron's orcs are spreading in the Southlands. And so the urgency with which they are riding makes no sense in this context, again, because the characters have no idea what is happening here. In Return of the King, there is urgency because both the audience and the characters know exactly what is happening and where. Also, the editing. When this situation looks hopeless for the Southlanders, we cut to the Númenóreans charging along, and then back to the Southlanders for a while. So the scene has no tension anymore because we know that they're coming to the rescue. In Return of the King, we know Rohan are coming in general, but we have no idea if they'll get there in time. That's what gives it tension, and that's what makes this so heroic. And finally, there's no build-up. The Númenóreans just appear and suddenly kill everyone. With the Ride of the Rohirrim, we build up to the charge with one of the best speeches in all of cinema.
Arise, riders of Theoden!
Now, I could go on about this scene, but this feels like a good segue into what I'm calling the grand epic speeches problem. As we all know and love, some of the most powerful moments in The Lord of the Rings are the grand epic speeches, like this.
Dark fire will not avail you! Flame of Udun!
Or this.
The ones that really mattered.
Or this. And yes, they are adapted from Tolkien's words, but they form core emotional moments in the Jackson trilogy, having been reworded slightly, moved to different moments, and just generally being given more significance and emotional weight in the films than they had in the books. The Rings of Power tries to do the same thing and fails on every count. And I can't look at every attempt the show makes to do a grand epic speech because it happens so bloody often, but let's just look at the 2 occasions in the Southlanders story when Bronwyn and Arondir try to do the inspiring speeches like Théoden or Aragorn, where they rally a frightened band of warriors into the fight of their lives. But unlike the speeches by Théoden or Aragorn, here the writing is about as generic as an MC trying to warm up a crowd at a corporate conference.
Do you believe it? Do you believe it?
And before you say that the Jackson speeches are so good because they use Tolkien's words directly, well, not all of them did. This speech?
A day may come when the courage of men fail.
Yeah, not in the books. I told you, this sort of big, grand, inspiring speech happens way more often in the Rings movies than in the books, which is why they also happen so often in the Rings of Power. And even when Rings of Power is trying to adapt Tolkien's words directly, they still get it wrong, like this scene.
There are powers beyond darkness at work in this world. Perhaps on days such as this, we've little choice but to trust to their designs and surrender our own.
This is trying to convey a similar sentiment to this. Galadriel is saying actually has the complete opposite meaning to what Tolkien was trying to convey with Gandalf's line. Tolkien's point is that there are forces outside of our control, and so we should focus our efforts on our own actions because that is what we do have control over. Tells Theo is that there are forces outside of our control, and so we just have to accept that and go along with whatever the universe has planned for us.
We've little choice but to trust to their designs and surrender our own.
So here the writers are clearly going for a moment like this one where the wise immortal character gives advice to the young mortal, but because they can't use Gandalf's words directly because he already said them in The Lord of the Rings, they tried to change it slightly. But in doing so, they ended up completely butchering Tolkien's original meaning. It's like in The Amazing Spider-Man when they want to say with great power comes great responsibility, but they don't want to use that exact phrase because it was already used so well in the Raimi trilogy, and so instead they say,
if you could do good things for other people, you had a moral obligation to do those things. Not choice, responsibility.
In both cases, instead of having the confidence to adapt the source material in their own right, the writers are limiting themselves creatively because they don't want people to think that they're copying the popular earlier adaptation that they know audiences are more familiar with. Because for all the showrunners talked about wanting to do their own thing and tell their own story in their own way, The Rings of Power is stuffed full of moments that either deliberately or accidentally serve to foster nostalgia for the Jackson trilogy because they knew that that was the version of Middle-earth that most people are familiar with. That's why you have them saying things like this. On the one hand, we were not interested in doing a show about the younger version of the same world you knew, where it's a little bit of a prequel. But then on the other hand, they say things like this. You meet Isildur and he's the young member of the family who has optimism and immaturity. Trace that guy to the tragic final decision. Or this young hot-headed Galadriel. How did she ever become that elder stateswoman? So these are two main characters where the showrunners themselves admit that the mystery and intrigue of their stories comes from the fact that the audience already knows who they are and where they end up. That sounds like the sort of thing a prequel does to me.
Is known in the wild as Strider. His true name you must discover for yourself.
I put off making this video for a long time because, as I am sure you will see in the comments, Rings of Power is one of those shows that is something of a lightning rod for criticism by people who aren't really interested in talking about the show itself. But the fact that the show has attracted that sort of backlash makes it hard to have a normal conversation about it as a piece of media in its own right. And I think that's a shame because as a Tolkien fan, if people are going to be adapting these stories, then I want those adaptations to be good, and if they're not, then I want to be able to be part of the debate about how they could be made better. The Rings of of Power is not a good adaptation of Tolkien. It's not even a good adaptation of the Jackson trilogy. But I don't actually think that this show was always destined to be as bad as it is. For all of its many faults, Amazon has made several popular TV shows adapted from works of fiction that have been well received by both the existing fan bases and general audiences. And these are some of the most interesting characters in Tolkien's Legendarium, and I am confident that the right creative team could have told a good story set in the Second Age, especially with the sort of budget that this show had. But instead of drawing on their rich well of source material, the Rings of Power instead chose to copy characters, motifs, and story elements from the Jackson trilogy. And what's worse is they did it in a way that did nothing to replicate the things that made those moments significant in the first place. So it ends up being both a pale imitation of a great trilogy while also failing to be a decent adaptation of Tolkien, or even just being a good TV show in its own right. At every turn, it feels like they were just going for the easiest option, rather than doing what they say they set out to do. Make a story in Middle-earth that deserves its own space on the shelf alongside the novels and the films. And from the looks of it, Season 2 will be no different.
Using to wear those rings. They must be destroyed.
The ring must be destroyed.
He is no man.
I am no man.
Leave Sauron to me.
Leave Sauron to me.
At the time I'm writing this, we are going to have 5 seasons of the Rings of Power. So if we are going to have all of this time, effort, passion, and money spent on telling these stories, then don't just make them half-hearted copies of something much, much better. Make them stories worth telling. Make them stories worthy of Middle-earth.
If you were to be remembered as the man who has made The Lord of the Rings, would you rather be remembered as a man who has said something or as a man who has made something?
I don't think you can distinguish. The made thing, unless it says something, won't be remembered.
Thank you.